Have you ever stopped to think that the life of a samurai could be simultaneously incredibly fascinating and bone deeply boring? Well, it is. Many people imagine sword wielding warriors, but the truth is that most days were filled with silence, discipline, and repetitions that today would probably make us yawn in 5 minutes. Strange, isn't it? Those who carried the honor of a clan lived surrounded by simple, almost banal routines that hid surprising secrets about strength, balance, and even how to deal with anxiety. The paradox lies there. Men trained to die at any moment, yet who spent much of their time tending gardens, writing diaries, or organizing the correct way to serve tea. It seems counterintuitive, but precisely in this monotony lay the secret of their power, a lifestyle that in many ways can teach even more about calm and focus than the combat techniques we see so often in movies. And perhaps the biggest controversy is this. While today we chase novelties, distractions, and quick wins, they lived with the bare minimum and found in it a life full of meaning. Isn't it precisely this lack of simplicity that leaves us so exhausted? Get ready, because throughout this story, you'll immerse yourself in the daily life of a samurai household. You'll hear the discreet sounds, smell the wood and incense, and wander through routines that seemed unimportant but held profound lesson. Who knows? Perhaps you'll discover that the peaceful life of these warriors may be the key to the rest you seek today. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this video from, and what time is it there now? In that feudal Japan, life seemed to revolve around a very well-defined set of positions. The samurai, for example, woke up already knowing who they were and what their role in the world was. There was no room for doubt. They were just below the landowners and above farmers, artisans and merchants. Nowadays, we think of social mobility, of climbing the ladder. But back then, the stairs were practically made of stone. The curious thing is that this order wasn't just political, it was also emotional. The son of a peasant didn't dream of being a samurai, just as someone of humble origins didn't see themselves occupying prestigious positions. It was as if destiny were written, and every gesture of the day was a reminder of it. Imagine the feeling of always being in a line where no one can change places, but there was a certain security in knowing who one was. The samurai, upon opening his eyes, knew clearly what awaited him: duty, honor, and obedience. A merchant, however, even with money, lacked prestige. This sounds strange to us, who today measure success by purchasing power. Imagine having a fortune and still not being respected on the street, a contrast that would make anyone question their choices. This rigidity, in a way, also functioned as a shield. Those within the samurai caste could count on exclusive privileges, the right to bear a sword, a voice in local decisions, and even a certain automatic respect. Today, it would be like walking around with a social identity card that opens doors without having to say a word. At the same time, it was burdensome, as the pressure to maintain honor was relentless. If we compare it, it would be like working at a company where your position is already decided before you're even born. You'd be a mid-level employee because your family was too, and that's it. It doesn't matter if you have leadership talent. This reality to us sounds suffocating, but to them, it was the natural order of things. It was a world of certainties, albeit harsh ones. And of course, this rigidity was reflected in the daily life of the samurai household, from the way children were raised to the manner of speaking to a guest. Everything followed invisible but very vivid. And it's curious to note how this social discipline even influenced the silence within the homes. But this silence has its own history, and we'll get to that. A samurai's residence was neither a palace nor a hovel. Made of wood, bamboo, and rice paper, it held a unique charm. Every space had a purpose. There was no excess, only the essential. It's curious to think that today we associate status with mansions filled with furniture, but the rare prestige lay precisely in well appointed simplicity. Upon entering, visitors could smell the raw wood mixed with the gentle aroma of freshly laid tatami mats. Sliding doors revealed spaces that transformed throughout the day. One room could be a living room in the morning and a bedroom at night. This flexibility is reminiscent of today's compact apartments, where every corner needs to be utilized creatively. The courtyard, however small, featured a garden with carefully placed stones, perhaps a small stone lantern, and a curiously shaped shrub. It wasn't luxury, it was aesthetic discipline. If today we use paintings on the wall to feel a home alive, they shaped nature itself as part of the decor. Imagine watering a bonsai and at the same time practicing patience. Furniture was sparse, a low table, cushions for seating, and discreet trunks for storing belongings. No giant closets or sofas that took up half the room. Interestingly, despite the lack of items, the house never felt empty. There was energy in the silence, almost as if each object had a ceremonial role. Today, it would be like living in a minimalist space, where less is indeed. This simplicity also had its practical uses. In the event of a fire, which was common in wooden towns, the house could be quickly dismantled. Yes, dismantle. Imagine if in the modern world we could box up our walls and carry them away when a problem arose. It sounds absurd, but back then it was a survival strategy. And the curious thing is that at the end of the day, when the oil lamps illuminated the wallpaper, the house acquired an intimate and tranquil atmosphere, an environment that invited reflection. And to think that all this organized space was the stage for a routine that began early with almost invisible rules, but nothing was more invisible and burdensome than the code of discipline that governed this life. The sun had barely risen, and the samurai household was already waking in silence. The day didn't begin hurriedly, but rather meticulously planned. The samurai woke with his mind focused on duty, and even the act of arising had something ceremonial about it. Today, many of us reach for our cell phones before even getting out of bed. Back then, the first gesture was reverence for our ancestors. Morning hygiene was performed with cold water drawn in buckets or basins. This contact with the cold awakened the body and reminded the warrior that life required endurance. Imagine trading the hot shower of a modern day shower for a cold basin in winter. It sounds uncomfortable, but for them it was a sign of vigor and discipline. The routine began with self control. Immediately following, there would be a moment of meditation or prayer before the home altar. This space, known as Butsudan, was simple yet rich in meaning. The silence, broken only by the sound of burning incense, helped create the serenity needed to face the day. Today, it would be like setting aside the first few minutes of the morning to turn off notifications and take a deep breath. Their diet also followed a restrained pattern: a little rice, miso soup, and tea. It wasn't a feast, it was just enough fuel to sustain body and spirit. And there's a lesson in this. Rather than seeking immediate pleasure, they valued functionality. Anyone who's tried swapping sugary coffee for green tea knows how this choice changes the body's rhythm. Even the children in the house were awakened early, learning from a young age that discipline wasn't optional. This collective awakening created a sense of belonging. Everyone aligned, each fulfilling their role. There was no room for the typical 5 more minutes laziness. It was as if the sunrise were a sign that life wouldn't wait. And it's curious how this dawn routine shaped the rest of the day. Every gesture, from washing one's face to one's posture before eating, was already a training ground for character. It was in this slow, meticulous rhythm that the samurai found order in his life, and it is in this order that the next step emerges, the incessant training that filled much of his waking hours. The sound of bamboo snapping in the yard marked the beginning of training. The samurai, still fresh in his mind from the morning's discipline, wielded his wooden sword and repeated movements dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. There was no rush, no spectacle. Each gesture was a silent conversation with his own patience. Today, when someone quits the gym after a week, it would be hard to imagine the almost unwavering constancy of that training. It wasn't just swordplay, of course. The Japanese longbow, the yumi, was practiced until the breath became part of the arrow. The sound of the bow snapping and the string vibrating filled the space in an almost ritualistic way. Anyone who has tried to learn the guitar knows. At first, your fingers hurt, but over time, the music flows. So too was the art of war, a learning experience that hurt before becoming second nature. There was also riding training, essential for rapid movement and open field combat. The children observed closely, learning early on that it wasn't about mastering the horse, but about bonding with it. The relationship was one of trust, not force. It was like driving a car today, but with the difference that the engine had feelings and needed respect. Interestingly, even in times of peace, training never stopped. The enemy might not be in sight, but negligence was seen as a greater danger than any sword. The body was kept alert and the mind sharp. How often today do we relax when nothing seems? The samurai did just the opposite. They trained even harder when war was far away. This training was not just physical, there were also strategy lessons, readings of Chinese classics, and reflections on battle tactics. War was studied as a science. It's like someone who, in addition to running, studies nutrition, physiology, and even sports psychology. They sought to be well rounded, not just strong. And, in the end, training served not only to prepare the body, but to educate the spirit. Every slash through the air, every arrow fired, and every ride was a reminder that life was, in a way, about being always ready. And this readiness also extended to the way they raised their children, molding them not only into warriors but into heirs to a discipline that could not be lost. In a samurai household, the education of children was not seen as an afterthought, but as the foundation of family honor. From an early age, boys were introduced to martial arts, learning to wield wooden swords that seemed too heavy for their short arms. But the idea wasn't immediate strength, but rather to accustom the body and mind to the weight of responsibility. Today, we can compare it to a child learning to play the piano. At first, the notes come out clumsy, but soon they become music. Girls, on the other hand, received lessons in etiquette, sewing, and music, but they also learned to observe. Their role went beyond what one might imagine. Many were trained to manage the household when their husbands were away, and in some families, the naginata, that long spear, was placed in their hands. Imagine a daughter trained in embroidery, but also capable of defending the home if necessary. There was also moral education. Respect, obedience, and self control were taught not through speeches, but through everyday example. Children saw their father getting up early, their mother keeping the house in order, and understood that there was no room for laziness. It's like when a child watches their parents read today. They learn without anyone having to say a word. Home was their first school. In addition to physical activity, the study of letters was encouraged. Boys copied calligraphy, read Chinese poetry, and texts by Confucius. It wasn't just about knowing how to fight, but also knowing how to think. It's curious to note how even today, some of the most respected leaders are those who combine strength and wisdom. The samurai understood this centuries before, and surprisingly, there was even room for music. Instruments like the baiwa and the shakuhachi flute were part of the learning routine. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a disciplined sound, training in patience and sensitivity. Imagine a boy who practices swordplay in the morning and plucks strings in the afternoon. This combination shaped a more complete human being. Ultimately, raising children wasn't just about them, but about perpetuating a legacy. Each lesson carried the expectation that the next generation would be even more faithful to the code of, and this expectation didn't end in childhood. It continued to grow, accompanying them into adulthood, where the wife's role emerged as a fundamental cog in the silent machinery. Within the samurai household, the wife was not just a supportive figure, but the silent heart of the routine. While her husband trained, served, or fought, she kept the wheels turning. She managed the servants, maintained order in the household, and educated her children so they would grow up aligned with the code of honor. Today, she would be like the person behind the scenes at a company who ensures everything runs smoothly without anyone noticing. Interestingly, despite living in a society marked by male hierarchy, many wives had a strong voice within the home. They decided on expenses, organized rice stocks, and maintained domestic discipline. It's as if they were operations managers, even without that title, and anyone who has organized the household accounts knows all too well the weight of this responsibility. Also served as a guardian of morals. She taught her daughters how to behave, her sons how to respect their elders, and more than that, she demonstrated this by example. Her posture, her silence at certain times, and even the way she bowed when serving tea were living lessons. Imagine learning values not from books, but by observing your mother's gestures every day. In some families, the wife also trained in light martial arts, especially with the naginata. This wasn't a rule, but it did happen. After all, if the house was attacked in the husband's absence, someone had to defend it. There are accounts of women who became legends precisely for their courage, proving that swordsmanship and delicacy could inhabit the same person. But her role went beyond defense or routine. She was responsible for keeping the peace within the house, balancing tensions and ensuring that the home was a place of order. She was like that person who, in a group of friends, knows just the right moment to tell a story to lighten the mood. Small gestures, but with a big impact. And when night fell, it was the wife who checked that everything was in place, lanterns lit, doors closed, children in bed. The day ended under her discreet but essential watchfulness, and it's interesting to think that while she maintained internal balance, the food served on the table, simple and symbolic, was another element that united the entire family. In a samurai's home, the meal wasn't a time for extravagance, but for balance. Rice, always present, formed the base of the dish. Alongside it came miso soup, pickled vegetables, and on more special occasions, some fresh fish. No banquets, no excesses. It was food designed to sustain, not to impress. Today, amid fast food and elaborate dishes, this simplicity seems almost revolutionary. The aroma of freshly cooked rice mingled with the light saltiness of the preserves, creating a welcoming atmosphere. The table wasn't laden with a variety of dishes, but rather small bowls, each with its own function. This arrangement reminds us how in minimalism, fewer elements can bring more focus. Eating wasn't a noisy social event, but a moment of quiet attention. It's interesting to see how this simplicity helped maintain health. Without excessive fatty meats or refined sweets, the samurai diet was rich in nutrients and modest in calories. Today, when there's so much talk about healthy eating, we see that the secret was already there centuries ago. Those who follow diets like the plant based or modern Japanese diet end up, without realizing it, reviving part of this tradition. Children learned from an early age to value food, not wasting grains of rice. The idea was that every food came from effort and sacrifice, that of the farmer who planted it, that of nature who provided it. This awareness is something we often lose. How many of us have leftovers on our plates without thinking about the journey that food took to the table? Interestingly, the act of eating in silence was also a lesson. The samurai chewed slowly, paying attention to the flavor, as if each spoonful were part of a ritual. Today we call this mindful eating or eating with presence. They already practice this naturally, without manuals or fads. Perhaps therein lies one of the secrets to keeping the body and mind disciplined. And of course, green tea was a must. Served hot with a slightly bitter aroma, it helped to end the meal with serenity. This moment of pause reminded everyone that life wasn't just about battles or responsibilities, but also about daily rituals. And among these rituals, there was one that united aesthetics and spirituality in an even more striking way: the tea ceremony. When the kettle began to hiss and steam billowed into the air, the samurai household entered an almost solemn state. The tea ceremony wasn't about drinking, but about being present. Every gesture, from the way the bamboo ladle was held to the way the bowl was swirled, had meaning. Today, in these fast paced times, this practice feels like a rare pause, almost an invitation to slow down. The setting was meticulously prepared: clean tatami mats, a simple flower arrangement, and the soft light of a lantern. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of hot water being poured. And it's curious to note how this combination of smells and sounds created a meditative atmosphere. Anyone who has tried to drink coffee in silence, without cell phones or conversations, knows the difference it makes in one's mood. The aesthetics of tea taught something valuable. Beauty lies in imperfection. The ceramic bowl, often irregular, was not hidden, but celebrated. It was a lesson in humility and acceptance. It's like looking at a scar, not as a flaw, but as a story etched on the body. This philosophy, called wabi sabi, shaped the samurai's perspective on the world. More than a social act, the ceremony was a training ground for life. The patience needed to wait for the right temperature, the precision of movements, and the attention to detail were reflections of the code of conduct itself. Today, we can apply this to small things: cooking calmly, setting the table before eating, or even writing by hand instead of typing. These are exercises to cultivate presence. It's also curious how the ceremony balanced the warrior life. If sword training involved strength and precision, tea preparation involved delicacy and contemplation. It was as if the samurai balanced the cold steel of the katana with the gentle warmth of the ceramic bowl, a way of not letting life weigh down one way. And in the end, when everyone drank in silence, the tea was not just tea, it was respect, discipline, and communion. Simple gesture that upheld profound value. And it is at this point that we realize even the clothing worn on the occasion carried meaning, for attire was also part of the silent language of that routine. Within the samurai household, clothing was not just a matter of choice, but of identity. The kimono, fitted with firm strips of fabric, revealed social standing and the day's occasion. Every fold, every layer had a purpose, and it wasn't about exaggerated luxury, but symbolism. Today, we might think of a tie or a suit. They aren't always comfortable, but they immediately communicate who we are and where we are. The sword, the katana, completed the outfit. It wasn't an accessory, it was an inseparable part of the body. Carrying it at your side was like carrying your own reputation. Imagine leaving home today without a cell phone or documents. The feeling of being incomplete would be similar. The sword was your calling card, the symbol of honor visible to all. The colors and patterns of the kimono also spoke volumes. Sober tones conveyed respect and seriousness, while subtle details could indicate clan. Nothing was random. If today we use logos to signal belonging, they used fabrics and embroidered coats of arms. Even the way the belt was tied could reveal discipline or carelessness. Interestingly, indoor clothing was lighter, made of cotton, while for formal occasions, heavier fabrics like silk were worn. This shift demonstrated not only practicality, but also contextual awareness. It was like swapping flip flops for dress shoes today, small gestures that change how we're perceived. For wives and daughters, the care was equally rigorous. Long kimonos, wide sleeves, and colors that reflected age or marital status. Nothing was random, and even the slow walk was part of the ensemble. Anyone who's ever tried to walk in more ceremonial clothing, like long dresses or academic robes, knows that the body needs to adapt to the fabric. It was no different with them. And of course, the formality of the attire also taught discipline, placing each piece in its proper place, adjusting the knot of the sash, carrying the sword with poise. It was all part of a silent training, a training that prepared the samurai not only to be seen, but to be respected, and this respect was sustained by something even deeper, the code of conduct that dictated every step of life. Bushido wasn't a book kept on a shelf, but a set of principles lived out in everyday life. Honor, loyalty, courage, and self control were more than just pretty words. They were the solid ground on which the samurai walked from the early hours of the morning until the lanterns were extinguished at night. Everything was filtered by this code. Today, we can compare it to personal values that shape decisions. Those who live by their principles feel less hesitation when making choices. Loyalty was perhaps the heaviest stone in this construction. The samurai had to be ready to serve his lord to the last drop of his blood. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a company or a leader without even considering switching sides for greater benefit. Such absolute fidelity sounds almost unthinkable to us, accustomed to thinking in terms of contracts and convenience. Honor also carried immense weight. A slip up, a public failure, could tarnish not only the samurai but his entire family. It was as if a family name were a crystal vase, a crack in which could forever be damaged. And in extreme cases, the only way to repair this vase was to sacrifice one's own life, a high price to pay to maintain one's self-control was trained in every detail. It wasn't just about controlling emotions in battle, but also about controlling impulses in everyday life, avoiding excess food, speaking only when necessary, maintaining composure even in moments of pain. Anyone who has tried not to react to provocation in traffic knows how this skill requires constant practice. It's curious to note that for them, courage didn't mean the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Bushido didn't call for fearless warriors, but men capable of conquering their fears in the name of something greater. This vision still applies today. How many entrepreneurs, artists, or family men fail to forge ahead, even in the face of uncertainty? Courage is moving forward, even when trembling. And so, Bushido wasn't confined to the battlefield, but permeated domestic life. The way samurai dressed, ate, trained, and even raised their children reflected this invisible code. And precisely because it wasn't written in stone, but engraved in actions, it required another complement, intellectual and cultural practice, which came through reading and calligraphy. In the life of a samurai, training was not limited to the sword. The mind also needed sharpening, and this came through reading and calligraphy. Many dedicated themselves to copying classical texts, tracing each line with brush and ink, as if it were a meditation. The sound of the brush gliding over the paper reminded them that patience was also a weapon. Today, we can compare it to someone writing a diary by hand, discovering calm between words. Reading Chinese poetry and Confucian texts helped shape values and deepen thought. The samurai was not only a warrior, but also a silent philosopher. Imagine a soldier who, after a day of physical training, sits down to read about ethics and justice. This contrast formed well rounded human beings, something we still admire in leaders who combine strength and wisdom. Calligraphy, in turn, was not just an aesthetic practice. Each stroke required controlled breathing, a steady hand, and mindfulness. Anyone who has tried to draw beautiful letters knows how much the mind needs to concentrate. In the case of the samurai, it was a training ground for mastering not only the brush, but also oneself. Writing was a reflection of the soul. A crooked stroke revealed a restless spirit. This habit also created a connection with spirituality. Many copied Buddhist sutras, believing that by writing, they absorbed the teachings in depth. It's like someone who jots down passages from books to better retain ideas, except that in their case, each line carried sacred weight. It was study, but also prayer. Interestingly, children were encouraged to practice writing from an early age. Mistakes weren't grounds for punishment, but for repetition. They wrote until their hand became steady. It was a patient learning process, which contrasted with modern immediacy. Today, when typing on a cell phone, we don't think about the stroke. For them, each line was like a sword being forged. And of course, this cultivation of the mind wasn't just left in the air. Reading and calligraphy were like invisible roots that supported the warrior's trunk. Without them, the discipline would be mere bark. With them, there was depth, and it was in this depth that one understood the importance of symbols passed down from generation to generation, like the sword itself, which carried more than steel, it carried the family history. In the samurai household, the sword was not just an instrument of war, but a link between generations. The katana, passed from father to son, carried the weight of victories, sacrifices, and silences. The shine of the steel reflected not only the face of its wielder, but also the ghosts of their ancestors. Today, we might compare it to family heirlooms like rings, watches, or even a house. But for them, the sword had a soul. Receiving this weapon was an almost sacred moment. The son didn't see just an object in his hands, but a responsibility. It was as if someone had handed him an unfinished book, waiting for him to write the next chapters. And each scratch on the blade was a paragraph of the family's history. Anyone who has inherited something of sentimental value knows the chill that comes with it. Interestingly, even in times of peace, the sword remained present, kept reverently. It didn't need to be worn to show importance. It was a symbol of status, but also of commit. Imagine having an object in your home that constantly reminded you you live not only for yourself, but for those who came before. It was a daily reminder of discipline. There was even a lot of care taken with maintenance, polishing the blade, changing the handle, keeping the scabbard intact. All of this was part of the routine. It wasn't a task delegated to just any servant, but often performed by the samurai himself. And herein lies an interesting lesson: caring for that which represents who we are. Just as someone today lovingly cleans a photo of a grandfather or restores an antique piece of furniture, the samurai cared for his weapon. For the younger generation, this inheritance served as a moral compass. Knowing that a grandfather had wielded that sword in defense of the clan gave meaning to the endless hours of training. It was like having a silent witness in the corner of the room, observing whether every gesture lived up to the lineage. The sword demanded no words, but it demanded consistency. And of course, it wasn't just the men who felt this weight. Wives and children also understood the object's value. They knew it wasn't a piece of metal, but a condensed history. And it's curious to note how, alongside this visible heritage, there were also invisible teachings, transmitted more discreetly, such as the secret defense training among some of the women in the house. Although the samurai household's focus was on men, there was a curious and little discussed aspect. Some women also trained in martial arts. The most common weapon was the naginata, a long spear that combined reach and lightness. For them, it wasn't about glory on the battlefield, but about ensuring the protection of the home in the husband's absence. Today, it would be like someone who, in addition to managing the household, learns self-defense techniques for unforeseen circumstances. Training took place discreetly, often in the backyard, away from prying eyes. The sound of wood hitting the ground, the repetitive movements, and the firm posture showed there was no room for play. Imagine a mother who, after preparing meals, picks up a gun and practices as if it were part of her routine. This duality was part of their daily life. Interestingly, for many young women, learning the naginata was also an exercise in posture and discipline. It wasn't just about fighting, but about keeping the body erect, breathing steady, and the mind focused. This directly reflected the way they walked, spoke, and even interacted. It's like when someone does ballet today. They don't just dance on stage, but carry that elegance into their everyday lives. There were even stories of women who became legends for defending their homes in extreme situations. Their courage wasn't recorded in books like that of great generals, but circulated through oral histories. They're like those stories of grandmothers who faced enormous hardship and, even without fame, became silent beacons of strength. This training also served as a reminder, even in the silence of the house, danger could be near. Being prepared was part of being prudent, and in a way, this habit showed that the line between masculine and feminine was less rigid than it seems. After all, when family honor was at stake, everyone was a guardian. And in the end, these women trained not just for war, but to maintain the sense that the samurai home was a protected space. The husband's sword and the wife's spear complemented each other, like two sides of the same coin. And within this harmony, there was also a space dedicated to the spiritual, the domestic altar, which sustained the home in reverent silence. In the quiet heart of the samurai home, there was always a small altar, the butsudan. It wasn't imposing, but it carried an unmistakable presence. There rested incense, Buddhist statuettes, and wooden tablets bearing the names of ancestors. It wasn't just decoration, it was living memory. Today, we can compare it to those homes where photos of grandparents occupy a prominent place in the living room, a daily reminder of where we came from. The ritual before the Butsudan took place early in the morning, or at dusk. A candle was lit, a bowl of rice was offered, and the soft sound of a metal bell echoed through the room. It was in these small gestures that the samurai found serenity before facing the challenges of the day. It's curious to think that while today many start the morning checking email, they preferred to connect with the lineage that preceded them. The scent of incense wafted through the hallways, permeating tatami mats and clothing. For the children, this aroma was almost a physical reminder of spirituality. The sense of smell cemented respect in their memory, just as certain perfumes today transport us to specific memories. For them, that scent was linked to the idea of reverence. It was not uncommon for samurai to kneel before the altar in moments of crisis, seeking clarity. He didn't expect an immediate answer, but rather the balance that came from pause. It was like when someone today sits in silence with a rosary, a Bible, or even a journal. The practice matters little. The effect of reconnecting with oneself is what strengthens. It is also curious that this altar united the sacred with the everyday. There was no rigid boundary between spirituality and practical life. The same space that received reverence also received the gaze of children, learning without words the weight of respect. It was a silent school where each lit candle taught gratitude and continuity. And of course, this sacred space coexisted with the sounds of the house: children's laughter, creaking doors, training in the backyard. Life went on, but the altar remained, a reminder that something greater was sustaining it all. And this balance between order and movement was also reflected in another fundamental part of the home: the presence of servants and apprentices who shared the family routine. In the samurai home, daily life was not sustained solely by the family. There was always a discreet presence of servants and often apprentices in training. They took care of the heavier tasks: cleaning, carrying water, preparing firewood, and at the same time they observed everything silently, absorbing discipline and customs. It was as if the house were a living school, where every gesture had pedagogical value. Servants weren't just laborers, but an essential part of the machine. They knew the place of every object, the time of every meal, and even the right tone to announce visitors. Anyone who's worked in a team knows it's not just about completing tasks, it's about anticipating needs. And for the samurai, this synergy was essential to maintaining order. The apprentices, often young men from less wealthy families, saw service to the samurai as an opportunity to learn. They helped with simple tasks, but also observed training, calligraphy practices, and even ceremonies. It was like an unpaid internship, but a valuable one. Imagine living alongside someone you admire every day. Just being there was training in itself. Interestingly, the relationship between masters and servants was not limited to obedience. There was also loyalty built over time. Many servants remained in the same household for life, becoming almost members of the family. It's similar to modern stories of servants who stay with entire generations, creating bonds that go beyond work. But there were also tensions. Mistreated servants could become a silent threat, and disloyal apprentices were a risk to the house's reputation. Therefore, the samurai needed to cultivate respect, not just demand obedience. It was a lesson in leadership. Commanding isn't enough. You must inspire trust. This insight has spanned centuries and remains valid. And so, between orders and services, these invisible figures help sustain the life of the home. The creaking of the tidy door, the fire lit at the right time, the always fresh water, everything passed through their hands. And while their work sustained the routine, there was another space that sustained the aesthetic soul of the family: the garden, cultivated with the same discipline that cultivated honor. The garden of the samurai house was not a mere adornment, but an extension of the family's soul. Every stone, every shrub, every grain of sand had been placed with intention. It was a silent way of expressing discipline and contemplation. Today, we can think of someone who arranges their bookshelves by color or size. It's not just organization, it's also aesthetics and identity. The sound of running water and small fountains, the scent of discreet flowers, and the contrast between moss and stone created a meditative space. There, the warrior could breathe deeply and remember that there was beauty, even amidst the weight of duty. It was like a break between stressful meetings, only shaped by nature. Anyone who has cared for plants at home knows the therapeutic power of this gesture. Interestingly, these gardens were designed to represent miniature landscapes. A lake could symbolize the sea, a tall rock could resemble mountains, and a patch of carefully raked sand could imitate waves. In other words, the garden was not only visual, but also symbolic. That's like when someone builds a model city. They reduce the world to fit in the palm of their hand. Daily care required patience. Trimming bonsai trees, removing dead leaves, raking sand into harmonious lines. None of this was done in a rush. Every detail was a training in attention. Today, with so many digital distractions, few allow themselves to repeat simple gestures in silence. But this repetition shaped character. It was discipline disguised as aesthetics. Children also participated. They often learned from an early age how to care for small shrubs or observe the changing seasons in the garden. This contact fostered respect for nature and taught that human time must align with the earth's time. It's a lesson that still resonates today when someone decides to plant a vegetable garden at home. And when the sun set, the stone lanterns illuminated the space with a soft light, transforming the garden into an almost dreamlike setting. The samurai could then sit, listen to the crickets, and reflect on life. And in this contemplative silence, the habit of recording these impressions on paper also emerged through the writing of diaries that recorded both their daily lives and their most intimate thoughts. Among the many silent habits of the samurai, there was one particularly intimate one: journaling. These weren't the emotionally charged records we often imagine today, but sober notes focused on discipline, reflection, and even to-do lists. It was an attempt to bring order to the invisible chaos of the mind. Today, many people practice so-called journaling, but the samurai already knew the power of writing to organize thoughts. The diary might begin by describing the day's weather, a seemingly trivial detail that revealed a keen observation of the world around them. Cloudy sky, strong wind, training completed. Simple phrases that, repeated over time, created a faithful portrait of routine. It's like when someone today writes down habits on their phone without realizing they're constructing their own narrative. There was also room for philosophical reflection. The samurai recorded dilemmas about honor, doubts about difficult orders, and even small personal victories. This writing functioned as a conversation with himself, a way to purify his thoughts. Anyone who has written a letter that they never sent knows how it relieves the inner burden. Interestingly, many of these diaries also served as manuals for their children and grandchildren. By rereading the notes, subsequent generations learned not only war techniques, but also life insights. It was like inheriting not just a sword, but the mind that wielded. How many of us wouldn't want to have written records of our grandparents, showing how they thought? This practice also reinforced self control. Writing required stopping, reflecting, and choosing words calmly. Instead of reacting immediately to a situation, the samurai learned to observe it before acting. It's a lesson still useful today. Before making impulsive decisions, writing them down can bring clarity. The diary was, in a sense, a silent teacher. And of course, among routine records and reflections, notes also emerged about concrete problems, such as the debts that haunted many samurai. After all, behind the image of honor and discipline, there were also financial pressures that challenged the stability of the household. Despite all their prestige, many samurai lived a silent contradiction. They were constantly in debt. Their pay came in rice, a stipend that seemed sufficient on paper but in practice proved limited compared to household expenses. Imagine receiving a fixed salary in food baskets with no cash to cover unexpected expenses. That was exactly the reality. The problem was compounded because in times of peace, samurai continued to incur expenses for training, weapon maintenance, and household maintenance. Meanwhile, merchants, theoretically lower in the hierarchy, were growing rich through business. This reversal was deeply disturbing. It's as if today, a respected doctor earned less than a digital influencer. Status didn't keep pace with pockets. Many ended up asking merchants for loans, which resulted in veiled humiliation. Those who socially should be respected found themselves dependent on those whose society considered inferior. It was a painful paradox. Imagine a renowned judge having to rely on an intern to pay the bills. His pride was at stake. Wives, in this scenario, played a crucial role. They managed every grain of rice, controlled expenses, and even improvised to maintain appearances. Careful clothing, frugal meals, and domestic discipline were strategies to prevent the family's honor from being tarnished by poverty. It was a silent but vital form of financial management. Interestingly, this tension also shaped culture. Many samurai began dedicating themselves to writing, the arts, and bureaucracy as a way to supplement their income and maintain relevance. They became government officials, teachers, or even tea ceremony masters. The war might be far away, but the bills were still coming in every day. And behind this economic pressure lay another lesson: dealing with death as a constant possibility. After all, if financial life was already unstable, life in battle brought even greater risks. Hence the training for seppuku, not as a glorified act, but as a reminder that when honor was lost, the last resort was also on the table. Among the darkest aspects of samurai life was the preparation for seppuku, the ritual of honorable death. It wasn't physical training in the usual sense, but mental and spiritual preparation for the possibility of sacrificing one's own life. Simply living with this idea shaped one's character. Today, It seems unthinkable to imagine someone being educated to accept death as an honorable outcome. The training included not only practical instructions, but also reading accounts of warriors who had undergone the ritual. The samurai learned that seppuku was not a failure, but paradoxically, a victory over shame. It was a chance to show loyalty, even in the end. Imagine being taught from an early age that even the manner of death must be dignified. Interestingly, this preparation not only generated fear, but also discipline. Knowing that life could end at any moment made the samurai value every gesture. Their way of speaking, dressing, and even eating were permeated by an awareness of finitude. It's similar to the modern philosophy of memento mori, which constantly reminds us death is certain. What matters is how we live until then. This training also had an impact on the family. Wives and children knew the constant risk of losing the head of the household, and this created an atmosphere of sobriety in the home. There was no room for long-term illusion. It was like living with suitcases always packed for an unexpected trip. At any moment, life could change drastically. In some cases, young samurai symbolically practiced the movements, not to execute them, but to internalize the idea of courage in the face of the inevitable. It was psychological training, as if they wanted to numb their fear. Today, perhaps we can compare it to people who practice crisis simulations to avoid losing themselves in real panic. And despite the hardship, this preparation didn't impede the contemplation of life. On the contrary, it reinforced the appreciation of the little things: the sunrise, the silence of the garden, the shared tea. It was as if the shadow of death made each moment seem clearer, and this connection with life was also expressed in the respect for the seasons, which marked the silent rhythm of the samurai routine. In feudal Japan, the seasons weren't just climatic changes, but an integral part of samurai life. Winter brought not only cold, but also reinforced discipline. Spring wasn't just flowers, but rebirth. Each season was laden with symbolism, reflected in rituals, clothing, and even the way meals were prepared. Today, when we often live indifferent to the natural calendar, this connection seems almost lost. The home's garden was the first thermometer of these changes. The falling leaves in autumn or the blossoming cherry trees in spring reminded everyone that human time is merely a reflection of nature's time. The samurai learned to contemplate these transitions, finding in them lessons of impermanence. It's similar to watching a child grow. Each phase brings beauty, but also passes all too quickly. Seasonal celebrations reinforce this bond. Hanami, for example, brought families together to admire the cherry blossoms. It wasn't just leisure, but a practice of sensitivity. The samurai learned that, like the flowers, life was beautiful precisely because it was brief. It's a reminder that still moves tourists today who travel to Japan just to see this natural spectacle. Even food followed the rhythm of the seasons. Fresh food was valued, and dishes changed according to the season. No strawberries in winter or corn in summer, as we see in supermarkets today. There was respect for the natural cycle. This practice, besides being healthy, brought a sense of harmony that was reflected in the body and mind. It was also curious that the training itself adapted. In winter, resistance to the cold was tested. In summer, discipline in the heat. There were no excuses to stop, but rather opportunities to strengthen with each challenge the weather brought. It's like those who today decide to run in the rain or the scorching sun, not out of necessity, but to prove themselves capable. And so, Respect for the seasons was not an isolated occurrence, but part of the very rhythm of samurai life. Each dawn was interpreted as a sign from nature, each ritual as a dialogue with time. And in this silent dialogue, even the sounds of the house, the creaking of the tatami mats, the blowing of the wind through the paper doors, took on new meaning, composing the daily symphony of existence. In the samurai routine, even silence had sound. The creak of tatami mats as someone walked, the soft sliding of paper doors, the rustle of wind through the cracks, all formed a discreet melody that accompanied the day. There were no radios or televisions, just these subtle noises, which served almost as a constant reminder of presence. Today, accustomed to headphones and playlists, we rarely pay attention to such simple sounds. Early in the morning, the sound of a bucket of water being placed on the floor marked the beginning of the routine. Later, the clinking of kitchen utensils, low conversations, and the sound of tea being poured filled the space with an almost hypnotic cadence. Anyone who has spent an entire day in the countryside, listening only to nature's offerings, can imagine the calm this brought. In the afternoon, the sound was dominated by training, wooden swords clashing, arrows cutting through the air, horses neighing in the background. It was a reminder that even within the peace of the home, discipline never wavered. Home was not only a resting place, but also an extension of warrior training. It's like when someone studies at home today. The living room becomes an office, and the sounds change according to the function. At night, the noises faded. All that remained were the whisper of oil lanterns being lit, the distant chirping of insects, and the soft rustling of clothes being organized before bed. It was as if the house breathed along with its inhabitant. Anyone who has slept in old wooden houses knows how inevitable and paradoxically comforting these sounds are. Curiously, even the silence of the domestic altar had sound. The crackling of incense, the soft echo of a small bell, the barely audible murmur of prayers. These weren't loud noises, but signs of a constant spirituality. The ear, trained to perceive the smallest details, learned to distinguish these details as part of life. And so the home was not only a physical space, but also an acoustic one. Every noise told a story. Every silence was filled with meaning. And when the sounds of the home combined with the call of the temple and daily spiritual practices, routine took on an even deeper dimension, where the invisible became part of everyday life. The samurai's life wasn't limited to swords and battles. It also involved a deep spiritual journey. Many followed Zen Buddhism, others maintained Shinto rituals, and the two traditions often intertwined in the same home. Meditation before a lit candle, a purifying bath in cool streams, silent reverence for ancestors. Each gesture reinforced the notion that material life was only part of existence. Zen Buddhism, in particular, taught samurai to seek serenity amidst chaos, sitting in the lotus position, observing one's breath, and letting thoughts pass like clouds was as valuable a practice as swordsmanship. Imagine a warrior who, before setting out on a mission, dedicates half an hour to absolute silence. This calm became his true armor. Shintoism, linked to nature and the kami, spirits present in rivers, trees, and mountains, remembered that the world was sacred in every detail. Picking a flower, walking through a forest, drinking water from a spring, everything had spiritual value. It's like when someone today feels peace walking barefoot on the grass, realizing that they are part of something bigger. The practices were not restricted to the samurai. Wives and children also participated, lighting incense, clapping their hands in front of the altars, or accompanying collective prayers. This created a sense of shared spiritual belonging. It was as if the whole house was breathing together toward the invisible. Interestingly, in times of war, these practices gained even more importance. The samurai knew they couldn't control fate, but they could prepare themselves spiritually to accept it. It's similar to an athlete who, before a competition, visualizes victory and finds strength in inner confidence. Spirituality served as invisible training to face the unexpected. And so, amid meditations, rituals, and reverence, spiritual life balanced the weight of practical life. The warrior was not only a blade, but also silence, not only discipline, but also faith. And this balance was reflected even in the way children were raised within the household, especially the eldest son, who bore the greatest responsibility of continuing the lineage. In the structure of the samurai family, the firstborn carried a greater weight than the others. He was not just another son, but the future head of the house, heir to the name and keeper of the ancestral sword. From a young age, he received more intense training, more visible responsibilities, and more demanding gazes. It was as if he lived under a constant spotlight, while his brothers walked in the shadows. The curious thing is that this position brought both privileges and pressures. The eldest son was respected, but also held to double standards. He couldn't waver, couldn't show weakness. Imagine being a teenager and already feeling that your every gesture would be remembered as an example for the whole family. It was less childhood and more preparation for adulthood. This training began early, while his younger brothers were still playing with bamboo swords. The eldest son was already practicing with masters, learning not only to fight, but also to lead. There were lessons in etiquette, administration, and even public speaking. It was like preparing someone not only for a military position, but also to be the leader of a clan. Expectation was also reflected in the small rituals of daily life. The eldest son served tea impeccably, led his siblings in bows, and even participated in household decisions in a learning tone. He was almost like a leadership trainee, constantly watched by his father. Anyone who has assumed early responsibilities in the family understands this feeling well. But there was a delicate emotional side to all this. The eldest son often had to stifle personal desires in the name of tradition. If he wanted to follow a different path, he would be unlikely to. It was like being destined to inherit a family business, even if his heart called for another life. The weight of continuity overcame individuality, and yet this role was seen as an honor. Carrying the sword, keeping the name alive, and protecting the family were both burdens and glories, and this balance between burden and privilege also extended to physical training. After all, besides the sword, the bow was considered a noble art, and the eldest son needed to master it with excellence. Before the sword gained the prestige we know today, the Japanese longbow, the yumi, was considered the noblest weapon. Its disproportionate size, sometimes exceeding the archer's height, required refined technique and extreme patience. It wasn't just about shooting arrows, it was about transforming breath, posture, and mind into a single movement. Anyone who's tried target shooting understands it's not about strength, it's about control. The training took place in silence. The archer adjusted his feet, slowly pulled the string until he heard the characteristic sound of tension, and then, in an almost imperceptible instant, the arrow sliced through the air. The sharp thud of impact against the target was not a celebration, but a confirmation of discipline. It was like discreet applause for a well-executed gesture. Interestingly, the bow was seen not only as a weapon, but also as a spiritual path. Kudo, or way of the bow, taught that the goal was not to hit the external target, but to align the internal target, the mind. Correct shooting was a consequence of inner balance. Imagine a musician tuning his instrument. If the soul is not in tune, the music will not come out. This training shaped not only warriors, but also more centered individuals. Many samurai claimed that after years of practice, accuracy no longer mattered, but the feeling of being in harmony with the bow. Today, it's similar to practicing yoga or meditation. The focus isn't on performance, but on the state achieved during the exercise. Furthermore, the bow was essential in open field battles. Distance provided a strategic advantage, and mastering the Yumi could decide wars even before hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't just philosophy, it was also survival. It's like studying theory and practice simultaneously, knowing that one complements the other. And so, between arrows fired and silences maintained, archery training became a symbol of refinement of body and mind. But the samurai's life didn't stop there. Beyond weapons, there was also room for the art of music, which softened the burden of training and taught another form of discipline. Within the samurai household, music wasn't a luxury but a discipline. Instruments like the baiwa, a four-stringed lute, or the shakuhachi flute were commonplace in children's learning. It wasn't just entertainment, but also about cultivating sensitivity and focus. After all, if the sword trained the body, music trained the soul. It's like enrolling a child in piano lessons today, not to develop an artist, but to develop patience and coordination. The sound of the baiwa echoed softly through the corridors, accompanying recitations of poems or ancient stories. Each note seemed to carry centuries of tradition. The flute, in turn, was even used as a form of meditation, blowing slowly and precisely required breath control, which also aided physical mastery and battle. It was music, but also exercise. Interestingly, warriors themselves often dedicated themselves to music. After hours of sword training, they would sit down to pluck strings or play the flute. It was a way to balance strength and delicacy. Imagine a martial artist who, at the end of the day, paints pictures to relax. This contrast prevented life from being consumed solely by hardship. Wives and daughters also participated, learning traditional songs that were passed down from generation to generation. Music filled moments of celebration, but also of mourning. In funeral ceremonies, for example, the flute provided a deep lament, helping to transform grief into reverence. It's like a soundtrack that gives meaning to human emotions. And there was also the community value. Samurai families gathered for gatherings where music and poetry were shared. There was no passive audience. Everyone participated in some way. It was an environment in which discipline and sensitivity were mixed, reminding us that life could not be made up of steel and rigor alone. Thus, music became a silent part of education. It formed not only artists, but more complete human beings, capable of handling the hardships of life and the gentleness of the soul. And within this environment of sensitivity, another indispensable skill also emerged: the art of formal letter writing, which carried as much weight as a well-wielded sword. In the samurai household, writing a letter wasn't a common task, but almost a ritual. Every stroke of calligraphy had to convey respect, and even the choice of paper and ink mattered. It wasn't just about communicating, but about revealing character. It was as if calligraphy were an extension of one's own posture. Today, in the age of instant messaging, it's hard to imagine the weight a letter once carried. The language used was formal, full of politeness formulas that required mastery. A simple greeting could take several lines, showing deference to the recipient. Interestingly, behind this excessive formality lay a strategy. Demonstrating humility was also a way of preserving honor. It's similar to when we use academic titles or job titles in corporate emails to demonstrate respect. Each letter was read as a reflection of the education received. If the words were clear and the lines firm, it showed discipline. If there were mistakes or carelessness, it tarnished one's reputation. Imagine being judged not only by what you write, but by how you write it. This pressure turned each correspondence into a veritable examination of conduct. Letters also served as a political link. Alliances between clans were often initiated or strengthened through them. The tone needed to be calculated. The balance between firmness and respect was essential. It was like negotiating contracts today, but without lawyers. The pen was the only weapon, and a misplaced word could cost dearly. In the domestic environment, letters had another role: to transmit teachings. Parents wrote to their children when they were far away, reinforcing Bushido values and sharing experiences. These letters were kept as treasures, reread countless times. It's like when someone today receives an inspiring message and prints it out so they won't forget it. And so, formal writing became an inseparable part of samurai life. It wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a tool of honor and a bridge of trust. But amid all this formality, there were also the changes brought about by time, such as the prolonged peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, which transformed many warriors into bureaucrats, changing the meaning of existence itself. With the arrival of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan entered a long period of peace. For the general population, this meant stability and prosperity, but for the samurai, it presented a profound dilemma. After all, warriors trained for war found themselves without battles to fight. It was like preparing an athlete for an Olympics that would never happen. The result? Many had to reinvent themselves. From warriors, they became bureaucrats. They filed taxes, handled documents, and managed local affairs. The social prestige remained, but the essence of the role seemed hollowed out. Imagine someone who trained their entire life to be a race car driver and suddenly has to work solely as a driving instructor. The skill is there, but the excitement is low. This change generated quiet controversy. There were those who took pride in serving the government peacefully, but also those who felt their honor eroded by the absence of war. Many began to dedicate themselves more to art, calligraphy, and philosophy, seeking to compensate for the lack of action. It's like retired soldiers who find refuge in painting or writing to cope with the void. The financial aspect also complicated the situation. With no battles to justify extra rewards, the rice stipend seemed even more insufficient. The image of powerful warriors contrasted with the reality of debt and modest living. This chasm between appearance and reality silently eroded the self-esteem of many. Interestingly, this prolonged peace ended up shaping a new samurai identity. More than warriors, they became symbols of discipline and culture. The absence of blood led them to value aesthetics, music, and spirituality even more. It's like when someone, forced to change professions, discovers talents they never imagined they had. And so, the Tokugawa peace controversy left deep scars. The samurai remained samurai, but his sword often remained hidden, silent. And in this silence, the household routine became even calmer, filled with nocturnal habits that, under the soft light of lanterns, revealed another side of samurai life. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the samurai house sank into a profound calm. The oil lanterns were lit one by one, casting a yellowish light that cast shadows on the paper walls. There was no rush, no noise from the illuminated streets, just the slow rhythm of dusk. Today, in contrast, the urban night seems to scream with honking horns and endlessly glowing screens. Simple dinner had already been served, and all that remained was the comfort of the family gathered together. Some reviewed the day's workouts, others dedicated time to reading or writing. The absence of modern distractions made every gesture more present. Imagine an entire room of people focused on writing or talking without cell phones vibrating every minute. The predominant sound was the wind rushing through the cracks or the insects outside. Children whispered to each other their mothers' organized clothes for the next day, and their fathers often retreated to meditate. There was no rush. The evening was seen as a time for retreat, not for prolonging activities. It was almost like a ritual of slowing down, something many seek today through relaxation practice. Interestingly, the soft lighting transformed the space. Shadows danced across the wallpaper, creating an almost poetic atmosphere. For those who grew up in this space, nighttime wasn't just darkness, but a setting for intimacy and reflection. Anyone who's lit candles at home during a power outage knows how it changes one's perception of time. These moments also strengthened family bonds. Stories were told, poems recited, and quiet songs filled the air. The day of discipline gave way to a space of restrained but present affection. It was as if the rigidity of routine eased a little, allowing tenderness to seep in. Small gestures, but they held the household together. And so, the calm nightlife concluded the cycle of the samurai day, a cycle that even in its serenity carried invisible tensions. After all, the family's reputation was a fragile treasure, one that could be tarnished by any slip, and this reputation needed to be cared for with the same zeal one would polish a sword. In samurai life, reputation was like an invisible treasure, yet more valuable than any material wealth. A slip of the tongue, a misplaced word, even an ill-timed gesture could compromise not only the warrior, but his entire lineage. It was like constantly walking on glass. Every step had to be carefully considered. Today, when a social media post can tarnish someone in seconds, we understand some of this weight. Reputation wasn't built solely on the battlefield, but in the details of daily life. How you received guests, treated servants, kept your house tidy. Everything was scrutinized. It was as if the entire world were a silent tribunal judging your every move. Anyone who has worked in an environment where everyone comments on even your posture in meetings knows how suffocating this can be. Interestingly, honor wasn't just individual, but collective. If a samurai failed, the shame fell upon his wife, children, and even ancestors. It was like carrying a surname that brooked no mistakes. This responsibility created discipline, but also immense pressure. Imagine a student who feels that his grade affects not only himself, but the image of his entire family. Reputation also defined opportunities. An honorable samurai could be invited to administrative positions, gain access to better alliances, and even marry his children into prestigious families. A stain of dishonor, however, closed doors almost irreversibly. It's similar to the reputation of companies today. One flaw can jeopardize entire contracts. This excessive caution even shaped the way they spoke. Silence was often safer than words. better not to risk misunderstandings. This restraint, though limiting, created an air of sobriety in. Anyone who spends time with highly respected people realizes they often say little, but when they do speak, every word carries weight. And so reputation loomed like a constant shadow over the samurai routine. It was an invisible presence, a reminder that any mistake could echo for generations. And when the day finally ended, this weight lay with them on simple mattresses in the silence of the tatami mats, where rest didn't erase responsibilities, only prepared them for anew the next morning. As night fell, the samurai house became a space of almost absolute stillness. Feudans were spread out on the tatami mats, each in its own place, and the room was lit only by the faint glow of a lantern about to go out. There were no high mattresses or wooden beds. Sleep came from direct contact with the floor, simple and firm. Today, accustomed to anatomical pillows and soft beds, it would be hard to imagine this kind of rest. The sound of crickets and the wind replaced any conversation. The children snuggled close. The mother checked that the doors were closed, and the father often made a final bow before the altar, before bed. It was a routine without surprises, but full of meaning. The silence wasn't empty, it was protection. It was like sleeping knowing every detail was under control. Interestingly, at this moment, the body rested, but the mind remained alert. The samurai lay down, ready to rise in the middle of the night if necessary. His sword, carefully placed within reach, served as a reminder that even sleep was part of the discipline. It's like a firefighter who sleeps knowing he can be called upon at any time. The residents' even breathing became the soundtrack of the house. There was no loud snoring or excessive noise. Even the act of sleeping was restrained, almost ceremonial. Anyone who has spent the night in a monastery or retreat knows how this collective silence creates a unique atmosphere where rest feels shared. This sleeping style also revealed something about the samurai spirit, accepting the bare minimum as enough. There were no luxuries, but there was peace. There were no feather pillows, but there was discipline. It was the body surrendering itself to rest without demands, a lesson that today still echoes in practices like sleeping on the floor to correct posture or simplify one's routine. And so, the day in the samurai household ended as it began, in silence, discipline, and simplicity. The cycle closed only to be reopened at sunrise, and with it, all the rituals began anew, a routine so meticulous that it still fascinates today. After exploring every detail of the routine of a samurai household, it's hard not to wonder how many of these practices would still make sense today. Wouldn't waking up early with discipline bring more clarity to your life? And if you tried for a day, eating simply, in silence, paying attention to each flavor, wouldn't you discover a kind of peace you've never felt? The truth is, we don't need to carry swords to learn from these warriors. Their strength lay less in battles and more in their everyday habits. And you, have you ever stopped to think about which habits are shaping your own story right now? Are they strengthening you or weakening you without you even realizing it? If an entire life can be shaped by seemingly small rituals, like polishing a blade, tending a garden, or writing a journal, what would happen if you started applying these same principles to your daily life? Perhaps the discipline you seek lies precisely in the simple gestures you often overlook. So tell me, what part of the samurai routine would you most like to experience in your daily life? Tending to a garden, write a diary, or perhaps learn how to transform silence into strength? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And of course, if this video gave you some good food for thought, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you won't miss the next stories, which, besides relaxing, always contain hidden lessons where no one usually